The night the rustlers came to Silverlark Draw, the moon had gone behind a wall of cloud thick enough to swallow a lantern at 10 paces. Christopher Redding lay flat behind the water trough with his rifle across his forearm and no idea where his oldest son had crawled to. He could not call out. Any sound would tell the four men circling the barn exactly where his family was. Then a small, deliberate motion caught the edge of his vision. Behind the woodpile, a pale hand rose against the darkness. 3 fingers extended, folded, extended again. 2 men at the near corner of the barn, 1 at the loading gate. The 4th somewhere Christopher still could not see. His throat tightened. He had not been the one who taught his children to speak with their hands. He had only learned enough to follow. He signaled back. Ready, Amelia Redding, who had never spoken a word aloud in her life, had already placed both children exactly where they needed to be. 6 months earlier, on a raw October afternoon in 1887, the overland stage from Cheyenne rolled into the town of Ash Fork Bend, Wyoming Territory, carrying 1 trunk, 3 passengers, and a woman whose name Christopher Redding had only ever seen written on paper. Christopher stood on the platform in a coat that no longer fit him properly. He had lost weight in the 2 years since Clara died from a fever the doctor had never been able to name. His shoulders had thinned. His dark hair had gone the color of iron along the temples. He was 39, though a stranger might have guessed 45. Behind him, 10-year-old Samuel stood with both hands stuffed deep inside his coat pockets and his mouth set in a hard, thin line. 6-year-old Ruth clutched the hem of her brother's coat and pressed her face against the rough wool. Christopher had told them plainly what was going to happen. A woman was coming from back east to be their new mother. She was not their mother. She would live in the house. They would treat her kindly. That was all. Samuel had not spoken to him in 11 days. The stage door swung open. A conductor set down the step. First came a whiskey drummer with a satchel slung across his shoulder. Then a school teacher headed on to Rock Springs. Then, more slowly, a young woman stepped down. She was smaller than Christopher had imagined. No more than 5'3" in her worn boots, wearing a gray traveling dress that had been mended along both cuffs with small, careful, even stitches. Her hair was the color of new hay tied back beneath a plain bonnet. Her eyes were pale gray and steady. She held a carpet bag in one hand and a small leather-bound book in the other. When she reached the platform, she looked around once, took in every face without hurry, and settled her gaze on Christopher's. She had known him from the daguerreotype he had mailed east. He had not known her at all. Christopher stepped forward and lifted his hat. "Miss Thorne," he said. She smiled and dipped her head. Her lips moved carefully around his name in return. No sound came from her throat. Behind Christopher, the marriage agent from the Wyoming Correspondence Bureau, a small round man named Elias Dyer, was already pushing forward through the little crowd of onlookers. His face had gone the color of curdled cream. He carried a folder under one arm and a refund envelope in the other. "Mr. Redding," Dyer said quickly, low and urgent, "there has been a serious mistake. The girl is deaf. She's useless. Sign here, and I'll have your money back to you by nightfall." Christopher did not move. He looked at Amelia Thorne, who was watching Dyer's mouth with a steadiness Christopher had not seen in another human being since his wife died. She had understood every word. The wind rattled the loose boards along the platform overhang. Somewhere down Main Street, a mule brayed, and a man laughed at whatever the mule was complaining about. Christopher heard none of it. He was looking at the woman standing 3 feet in front of him, and he was watching her watch Elias Dyer's mouth. She had not flinched at the word deaf. She had not flinched at useless either. Her gray eyes had simply moved from Dyer's lips to Christopher's face, and now they were waiting. Christopher had spent the ride into town rehearsing what he would say to a stranger. Every sentence he had prepared was suddenly the wrong sentence. He set the rehearsals aside. "Mr. Dyer," Christopher said, without turning his head, "put your envelope away." "Sir, I don't believe you understand the situation. I understand it fine." Christopher's voice was low and even. He had used the same voice on horses that were about to bolt and on his own children when they were about to cry. The lady has come a long way. I'll not have her introduced to Wyoming by a man trying to send her back before her boots are dry. Dyer opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. Amelia Thorne raised her right hand, palm turned toward herself, and touched the tips of her fingers lightly to her chin. Then she moved the hand outward in a small, graceful arc toward Christopher. She was smiling, the smallest possible smile, only at the corners of her mouth. Christopher had no idea what the gesture meant. Later he would learn it was the sign for thank you. At that moment he only knew that a woman he had never met had just answered a cruel remark with courtesy, and that the two of them were now standing on a stage platform in front of half the town of Ash Fork Bend with the whole matter waiting on him. He turned to Dyer. "The papers, please." Dyer's mouth worked. "Mr. Redding, in good conscience I have to advise. The papers." Dyer produced them. Christopher took the pencil the agent offered, walked 3 steps to the bench outside the express office, spread the marriage license flat against the wood, and signed his full name in the careful square hand Clara had once teased him about, Christopher Elias Redding. Then he straightened, walked back, and held the pencil out to Amelia. She took it without hesitation. She read every line of the document. Her lips moved slightly as she read, the way a person does who is careful with what she agrees to. Then she signed, Amelia Grace Thorne. Her handwriting was small and steady and rounder than his. Dyer countersigned as witness and stamped the paper with a sigh that sounded like a man who had done his duty and washed his hands of the consequences. He tore the copy along the perforation, handed Christopher his half, and stepped back with a small nod that was already halfway to a farewell. "On your head, sir," he muttered. "On my head," Christopher agreed. Ruth had crept forward while none of the adults were looking. She stood now beside her father's leg, both hands still buried in her coat, staring up at the new woman with the frank appraisal of a 6-year-old who had not yet learned to hide anything. Amelia looked down. She crouched slowly so that her face came level with Ruth's, and she smiled properly for the first time. It was a full smile, a warm one, and it changed her whole face. Ruth stared. Then she pulled one small hand free and offered it. Amelia took it as gently as if she were receiving a bird. Behind them, Samuel had not moved from where he stood. He watched the exchange with a flat, closed expression, and when his father looked back at him, the boy turned his face away and stared hard down Main Street at nothing at all. Christopher pretended not to see. He picked up Amelia's carpet bag and her small leather book, and he tipped his head toward the wagon waiting at the hitching rail. "It's about 9 miles out," he said, speaking directly to her so she could see his mouth. "Rough road in places. We should get moving before the light goes." Amelia nodded once. She kept hold of Ruth's hand, and she walked to the wagon that way. The child on one side and her new husband on the other, past every window in Ash Fork Bend that had someone leaning against it. The road out to the Redding place ran north along Silverlark Creek for 4 miles, then bent east into the low broken country where the cattle grazed. Christopher drove without talking for the first mile because he did not know how a man was supposed to make conversation with a woman who could not hear him. Then he glanced sideways and found Amelia watching the country instead of watching him, and something in her posture told him she was not waiting to be entertained. She was simply looking. He let out a breath he had not known he was holding. Ruth sat between them on the wagon seat. Samuel had climbed into the wagon bed without a word and settled himself against the trunk with his back to all 3 of them. Christopher could feel the boy's silence like a cold draft along his shoulder blades. Halfway to the ranch, a covey of sage grouse burst up out of the brush beside the road. The horses shied. Christopher steadied them with one hand on the reins and one on the brake, and when he looked over, Ruth had grabbed Amelia's sleeve with both fists. Amelia had already put her arm around the child. She had felt the wagon jolt through the seat before she had understood why. "Grouse," Christopher said, half to himself, half to her. He caught her looking and repeated the words slowly so she could see his mouth. "Grouse," Amelia nodded. She lifted her hand and formed a small shape with her fingers, a beak opening and closing. Then she pointed at herself and shook her head, smiling a little, and Christopher understood that she was telling him she did not know that sign yet. She would learn it. Ruth watched the exchange with enormous eyes. The house at Silverlark Draw sat in a shallow bowl of land where the creek turned east. It was a log and frame structure Christopher had built with his own hands the summer before Samuel was born. A wide covered porch ran across the front. Behind it stood the barn, the smokehouse, the chicken coop, and the low bunkhouse where his one hired hand slept in the summer months. In October, with the summer hand gone back to his family in Nebraska, the bunkhouse was dark and shuttered. The house had been dark inside too since Clara died. Christopher had not meant for it to happen that way. He had simply run out of the strength required to keep a house alive. He kept the stove going and the floors swept and the children fed, and the rest of it he let go. The curtains stayed drawn because opening them each morning had been Clara's habit, and the flower bed along the porch had gone to weeds because tending it had been hers too. Amelia stepped down from the wagon and stood for a moment looking at the house. She did not comment. She had no way to comment aloud, but her face did not comment either. She simply took the house in the way she had taken in the country as a fact to be understood. Christopher carried her trunk inside and set it in the small back bedroom that had been the sewing room in Clara's time. He had cleaned it out over the past week, scrubbed the floor, moved a proper bed in, and put fresh linen on it. He had left the window unwashed because he had run out of time. He noticed the smudged glass now with a sting of shame. Amelia followed him in. She looked around the little room. Then she set her carpet bag down on the bed, walked back to the window, and drew one finger through the dust on the sill. She turned to Christopher. She smiled again, that small smile that only reached the corners of her mouth, and she made a gesture with both hands, palms down, moving them apart in a smooth line. Christopher shook his head. I don't know that one. She reached into her carpet bag and produced her small leather book. She opened it to a page near the front. It was a hand-drawn chart of signs, careful and beautifully lettered. She turned it around so he could see, and she pointed to one illustration. The word beneath it was fine. She was telling him the room was fine. Christopher felt something in his chest give way about a quarter of an inch. Supper's at 6, he said. He said it slowly, watching to be sure she caught his mouth. Ruth will show you the kitchen. Samuel and I have chores. Amelia nodded. She was still smiling. Samuel refused to come in for supper. Christopher found him behind the barn, forking hay into the horse stalls, with the sullen concentration of a boy who had decided to work until the world let him alone. Christopher watched him a moment from the doorway. Then he crossed the barn floor and took a second fork down off the wall and began pitching hay into the next stall over. They worked in silence for perhaps 5 minutes. She's not your mother, Christopher said finally. Nobody said she was. Samuel did not look up. Then why is she in the house? Because a house needs more than one grown person in it. Because Ruth is 6 years old, and I can't braid her hair. Because I'm gone from sunup half the year, and there's nobody to see to either of you when I am. Mrs. Halvers sees to us. Mrs. Halvers has her own farm and her own 6 children, and she has done us a kindness for 2 years that I have no right to keep asking for. Samuel stabbed the fork into the hay again. She can't even talk. She can talk fine, she just doesn't do it with her mouth. That isn't talking. Christopher stopped. He rested the fork against the post and looked at his son across the low wooden partition. Samuel had Clara's straight dark hair and Clara's stubborn chin and Christopher's own gray eyes, and at that moment he looked older than any 10-year-old had a right to. Sam, Christopher said quietly, I am not asking you to love her. I am asking you to sit at the table. Samuel's jaw worked. For a long moment, Christopher thought the boy might cry, and he braced himself for it because Samuel had not cried once at the funeral, and Christopher had been waiting 2 years for it to come out sideways. But the boy only nodded once, a hard short nod, and pushed past his father toward the house. Supper was quiet. Amelia had helped Ruth set the table, and the little girl kept sneaking glances at their guest with the barely suppressed thrill of a child who has been given a secret to keep. Amelia had taken off her traveling bonnet. Her hair, unpinned now around her face, made her look younger than she had on the platform. Christopher put her age at 24 or 25. There was a thin white scar along the line of her jaw he had not noticed before. She ate carefully. She watched Christopher's mouth when he spoke, and she watched Ruth's mouth, and once, when Samuel muttered something under his breath at his plate, she watched his mouth too. Whatever he had said, she did not react. After supper, Amelia stood up and began to clear the plates. Christopher started to tell her she did not need to that first night, but she had already carried the first stack to the wash basin. Ruth trailed after her. Christopher and Samuel sat at the table alone. "Pa," Samuel said. "Yes. How did you find her?" "Wyoming Correspondence Bureau. Mr. Dyer's outfit. You write a letter about yourself, and they match you with a lady back east who has written a letter about herself. Did her letter say she couldn't hear?" Christopher was quiet. Then he said, "No, it didn't." Samuel looked at him. "I don't think she wrote the letter," Christopher said. "I think somebody wrote it for her. And I think Mr. Dyer knew and did not tell me. Then send her back." "No. Why not?" Christopher considered several answers. Because it would shame her. Because she had come 1,000 miles in good faith. Because the papers were signed. Because Dyer had told him she was useless in front of half the town, and the word had settled in Christopher's chest like a stone, and he was not a man who could leave a stone like that where it lay. He said none of it. He said, "Because I gave my word." Samuel got up from the table and went to his room without another word. From the wash basin came a soft, rhythmic sound of water. Amelia was humming. She did not know she was doing it. The sound was tuneless and low and entirely her own. Ruth was standing beside her, watching her hands. The first week at Silverlark Draw settled into a rhythm nobody had agreed on out loud. Christopher rose before dawn to see to the stock. Amelia rose with him. He had not asked her to. The second morning he came into the kitchen at 5 and found the stove already lit, coffee already on, and a plate of biscuits already covered with a clean cloth beside the skillet. She was standing at the window in her gray dress with her hair braided down her back, watching the sky go pale over the eastern ridge. She turned when he stepped through the doorway. She had felt his boots on the boards. He did not know what to say. He said, "Thank you." She smiled and made the signs she had used at the platform, fingertips to chin, arc outward. Then she pointed at him and repeated it back at herself, and he understood she was telling him it was the same word both directions. By the end of the first week, Christopher had learned 6 signs. Yes, no, water, food, cold, thank you. He had learned them because Ruth had learned them faster and had begun teaching him at breakfast with the earnest, bossy patience of a 6-year-old who has discovered she knows something her father does not. Samuel had learned none of them, or so he claimed. On the 8th morning, Christopher rode into Ash Fork Bend for supplies. He had put it off as long as he could. The town knew by now, of course. Ash Fork Bend had 492 people and no secrets. He tied his horse at the rail outside Ballard's Mercantile and went inside with his list. Pearl Ballard was behind the counter. Pearl was 61 years old and had known Christopher since Christopher was Samuel's age. She looked up when the bell rang, and her face did the thing faces do when they have been practicing an expression and then have to use it. "Chris," she said too warmly. "Mrs. Ballard, I heard about your new missus. I expect you have." Folks are talking. Folks generally are. Pearl set down her pencil. She was a small woman with white hair pulled back tight and a mouth that had never in 61 years pretended not to know a thing. "Chris," she said, "Dyer's been in and out of here 3 times this week telling anybody who'll listen that he tried to warn you and you wouldn't be warned. He's setting up his story. Let him set it up. He's saying she's simple." Christopher put his list on the counter very carefully. He smoothed the paper flat with the side of his hand. "Mrs. Ballard," he said, "my wife reads and writes in English and in something else with a lot of curls on it that I think is French. She keeps a hand-drawn book of signs bound in leather that would fetch $3 from a schoolteacher. She lit my stove and made my coffee and had biscuits out before I was through pulling on my second boot. She is not simple. Pearl studied him. Then she nodded once, briskly, and picked up her pencil again. Coffee, flour, sugar, lamp oil, she read off his list. Bacon, salt, 2 pounds of dried apples, nails, 20 penny. Anything else? Yes, Christopher hesitated. Do you carry any books? Anything printed? She reads fast. Pearl's face softened. She came around the counter and led him to a shelf at the back where a small collection of secondhand volumes leaned against each other. Christopher picked out 3. A book of Longfellow's poems, a volume of a novel called Middlemarch he had never heard of, and, on Pearl's quiet suggestion, a plain-lined ledger with a cloth-bound cover. For the ranch accounts, Pearl said, if she's the woman you say she is. Christopher paid. He carried his supplies out to the wagon and loaded them under the canvas. Across the street, in front of the express office, Elias Dyer was standing on the boardwalk in conversation with 2 men Christopher did not recognize. Well-dressed men. Cattle buyers, from the look of their boots. Dyer saw Christopher across the street and lifted his hand in a small wave that was meant to look friendly and did not quite manage it. Christopher did not wave back. He climbed onto the wagon seat and turned the team toward home. The ledger changed things faster than Christopher had expected. He put it on the kitchen table the evening he brought it home from town, along with the books and a small tin of pen nibs and a bottle of India ink. Amelia looked at the pile without touching it. Then she looked at him. Christopher tapped the ledger. He mimed writing. Then he made a wide gesture that took in the barn, the corral, the pasture beyond the window. He shrugged and pointed at her and made a small questioning shape with both hands. Would you? Amelia's eyes went very bright. She sat down at the table without taking off her apron and opened the ledger to the first page. I keep the numbers in a box in the office off the porch, Christopher said, careful with his mouth. It's a mess. Bills of sale, feed receipts, tax papers going back 4 years. Clara used to keep it. Since she passed, I have not been able to. Amelia nodded. She did not ask to see the box that night. She simply ran her fingertips over the fresh, clean pages, opened the ink, and wrote her name in the top corner of the first page in her small, round hand. Then she closed the ledger and set it aside and got up to see about the supper dishes. The next morning, she asked him for the box. She asked with her hands, and with a leather book of signs open on the table between them, and with a pencil sketch of a box she drew on a scrap of paper when the signs failed. Christopher brought her the box. It was a wooden crate that had once held tinned peaches, and it was crammed with paper, the way a hen's nest is crammed with straw. Amelia lifted the lid. She looked at the contents. She looked at Christopher. Her eyebrows went up. I know, Christopher said. She smiled. It was the widest smile he had seen from her yet, and it was, he realized with a jolt, the smile of a person who had just been handed a puzzle she was going to enjoy. For 6 days, she worked at the kitchen table between meals. Ruth sat beside her and was allowed to sort the papers into piles by color and size, which pleased Ruth enormously and made her feel, for the first time in her small life, like an assistant to something important. Samuel walked past the table twice a day on his way to and from chores and pretended not to look. Christopher watched him pretend. On the 7th day, Amelia laid 3 sheets of paper in front of Christopher after supper. The first was a clean summary of everything he owned, everything he owed, and everything the ranch had earned and spent over the last 4 years. The second was a list, in 2 columns, of expenses she believed could be reduced and expenses she believed had been undercounted. The third was a single short paragraph. She had written it out because it was too long for signs. Mr. Redding, you are being overcharged for feed at Ballard's by nearly 1 cent a pound compared to the posted price at the freight depot in Rock Springs. Over 4 years, this is approximately $41. Mr. Ballard may not know. The bank in Ash Fork Bend is holding a note against your south pasture that was paid in full in June of 1885, according to your own receipt, which I have found. They are still charging you interest. This is approximately $19. I will not act on either matter without your leave. A. Christopher read the paragraph twice. He set it down. $41, he said. Amelia nodded. And 19. She nodded again. That's $60, Mrs. Redding. It was the first time he had called her that. He had not planned to. It had come out on its own. Amelia looked at him. Then she picked up her pencil and wrote one more line beneath the first. $60.11. I checked twice. Christopher laughed. It was a startled, cracked sound, the laugh of a man who had not used the muscle in a long time. From the doorway of the front room, where he had been pretending to whittle, Samuel looked up sharply. His father was laughing. The cold came in hard the second week of November. The creek skimmed over in the shallows one morning and did not clear again. Christopher brought the last of the cattle down out of the high pasture and moved them to the fenced ground behind the barn where he could see them from the house. It was the week the children broke, not Ruth. Ruth had gone over to Amelia the second day and had never come back. Ruth followed Amelia through the kitchen and the yard and the henhouse like a small, serious shadow. And when Amelia sat down of an evening with her leather book of signs, Ruth sat beside her and learned. By the middle of November, Ruth could sign 23 words and had begun inventing her own signs for things the book did not cover, such as the mean rooster and the good rooster and biscuits with jam. Samuel broke a different way. He came in from chores on a Tuesday afternoon with mud on his boots. Christopher had told him twice that week to leave his boots on the porch. Amelia had scrubbed the kitchen floor that morning. Samuel walked across it in his mud without looking down. Amelia was at the stove. She turned when she felt the vibration of his steps. She saw the tracks. She looked at Samuel. She did not scold him. She could not have scolded him aloud in any case. She simply looked at him with a steady gray gaze that had no anger in it at all, only a kind of patient waiting. And Samuel, who had prepared himself for a fight, found himself with nothing to push against. He picked up the water pitcher from the table and turned it over on the floor. The water spread in a wide, dark stain across the boards Amelia had scrubbed that morning. The pitcher rolled and did not break. Samuel stood in the middle of the mess, with his fists clenched at his sides. Breathing hard, waiting, Amelia set down her spoon. She walked past Samuel to the corner where the mop stood. She picked it up. She brought it back and held it out to him, handle first. Samuel stared at her. She did not move. Her arm did not waver. The mop hung in the air between them. For perhaps 10 seconds, Samuel held out. Then, without a word, he took the mop from her hand. He mopped the floor. He mopped it thoroughly, corner to corner, the way his mother had taught him before she died. Amelia went back to the stove and stirred her pot. When Samuel was done, he set the mop back in its corner and went outside without looking at anyone. Christopher had watched the whole thing from the doorway of the office off the porch. He had not intervened. He had understood, standing there with his hand on the doorframe, that if he intervened, he would break something that was trying to happen. That night, after the children were in bed, he sat down at the kitchen table across from Amelia. She had the ledger open. She was working through the November feed accounts. He waited until she looked up. He tested you, Christopher said slowly and clearly. Amelia nodded. He'll do it again. She nodded again. She was not troubled. She picked up her pencil and wrote on a scrap of paper. He is grieving. He does not know I am not the enemy. Christopher read it. He looked at her across the lamp. How did you know? He said. About the mop. Amelia thought a moment. Then she wrote, When my brother was angry, my mother made him churn butter. Anger is easier if the hands have work. Christopher read it twice. Then he asked the question he had been holding back for a month. Where is your family, Amelia? Her pencil hovered above the paper. She set it down. She looked at the lamp flame for a long moment. Then she picked the pencil up again. My mother is dead. My father put me in a school in Hartford when I was 7 and did not come back. The school found me the placement here. I had 2 choices. Wyoming or a laundry in Boston. I chose Wyoming. Christopher read the paragraph. He read it again. He set the paper down very carefully, as if it might tear. "Amelia," he said. She looked up. "You're not a placement," he said. "You're my wife." She looked at him for a long moment, then she picked up her pencil. "I know. I am beginning to." Amelia saw the lantern on the 15th of December, a little past 2 in the morning. She had never slept well. The world of the deaf at night is not silent so much as it is unwatched. And Amelia had learned in the schoolroom at Hartford that a woman who cannot hear an approaching footstep must at minimum see the shadow it throws. She slept lightly. She woke often. She kept her small back bedroom's curtain drawn open a hand's width so the moon or the stars or the far lamps of the county could speak to her through the glass. On the night of the 15th she woke because a fleck of light had crossed her wall. She lay still. She counted to 20. The fleck did not come again from inside the room, which meant it had not come from inside the room. She got out of bed. She crossed to the window in her stocking feet and stood back from the glass in the way a person stands who does not wish to be seen from outside. Out beyond the far corner of the north pasture, at the base of the low ridge where Silverlark Draw ran up into the broken country, a lantern was moving. It moved in a way lanterns do not move when they are being carried by a man walking somewhere. It rose and fell and rose again in a slow, deliberate pattern. 2 long. Pause. 3 short. Long pause. 2 long. Pause 3 short. Amelia watched the pattern for 4 full minutes. Then, from somewhere further out, beyond the ridge and invisible from her window, a second small light answered. 2 long. 3 short. She had grown up in a school where the girls signaled to each other after lights out with candle stubs and hand mirrors. She knew a signal when she saw one. She pulled her wrapper on over her nightgown. She went barefoot down the hallway and knocked, softly and steadily, on Christopher's door. Christopher woke instantly. He had slept lightly since Clara died, and lightly again since the wedding, though for different reasons. He came to the door in his union suit with a lamp not yet lit, and when he saw Amelia's face in the dim hallway, he did not ask what was wrong. He followed her. At the window of her small back room she pointed. Then she cupped her hand around the lens of her night lamp and made the shape of the signal for him. 2 long flashes and 3 short, holding her palm open and closed to shape the pulses. She pointed at the ridge. She pointed at herself and her eyes. She pointed at the ridge again. Christopher stood very still at her window. The lantern out on the ridge flashed its pattern once more, and then as they watched, it went out. The far answering light went out with it. "How long?" Christopher said. She was looking at his mouth. "How long has this been going on?" Amelia held up 2 fingers. 2 nights. She nodded. Then she held up 3 fingers and shook her head and held up 2 again. She had seen it 2 nights ago and had not been sure. Tonight she was sure. Christopher stood at her window for a long time in the dark. He was thinking about the 2 men in good boots who had been talking to Elias Dyer in front of the Express office in October. He was thinking about the fact that a man who runs a marriage bureau also, as it happens, receives every stranger who steps off the stage in Ashfork Bend. He was thinking about the cattle buyers who had come through in September, who had asked more questions about his south fence line than any honest buyer needed to ask. "Amelia," he said, "get dressed. Wake Sam." Not Ruth. She was already moving. 10 minutes later, the 3 of them were at the kitchen table in the dark, with only the banked coals of the stove for light. Christopher had a piece of butcher paper spread out flat and was drawing on it in pencil. He drew the house. He drew the barn. He drew the corral, the smokehouse, the woodpile, the low place along the creek where a man could come up unseen from the north. Samuel was 10 years old, and he was awake at 2 in the morning at his father's kitchen table, and he understood without being told that the game had changed. He did not sulk. He watched the pencil. "They'll come for the cattle," Christopher said, marking the fence line. "Not tonight. They're still counting us. But soon. Before Christmas, I'd guess. New moon's the 22nd. Amelia touched his wrist. He looked up. She pointed at herself, then at Samuel, then at Ruth's closed bedroom door. She made a sign Christopher did not know. Then she picked up the pencil and wrote in the margin of the butcher paper, "Teach us all your signs before then. Every one you have. We will need to speak in the dark." They had 6 nights. Amelia took the leather book of signs and sat down with it on the kitchen floor after supper each evening, and Christopher and Samuel and Ruth sat around her in a loose half-circle by the stove. She did not teach them the way a school teacher teaches. She taught them the way a woman teaches who has ridden a stage 1,000 miles into the country of a man who owed her nothing, and who now needed her family to be able to speak to one another in the dark. She began with the words a family would need at night on a ranch under attack. Man, 2 men. Barn, house, behind and front. Corner, gate, rifle, wait now, go come here. I see. I don't see. Ruth, Sam, Papa, Mama. She did not sign the last word. She wrote it on a piece of paper first and looked at Christopher, and Christopher looked back at her, and after a long moment he nodded once. She showed them the sign. Ruth learned it in 90 seconds and used it for the rest of the evening at every opportunity. Samuel learned faster than any of them. He did not admit that he was learning. He sat a little apart with his arms crossed and refused to practice out loud, but his eyes followed every motion of Amelia's hands, and on the 3rd night, when Ruth got the sign for behind the barn backward, Samuel corrected her without thinking. Amelia looked at him. Samuel flushed to the roots of his hair. He did not take it back. On the 4th night, Christopher rode into Ash Fork Bend and had a private conversation with the county sheriff, a leathery man named Wesley Coombs, who had known Christopher's father. Christopher did not tell him what Amelia had seen. He told him what a woman in his house had seen, which was a different thing and a smaller thing. And he let Wes Coombs make of it what he would. Wes Coombs made a great deal of it. He had been trying to catch the Silverlark rustlers for 18 months. He and 2 deputies would ride out to the Redding place on the 21st, quietly, before dark. They would sit in the bunkhouse with the shutters closed and the horses out of sight in the smokehouse yard. They would wait. "Redding," Wes said as Christopher was leaving. "You sure about this?" "I'm sure about my wife," Christopher said. Wes Coombs looked at him a long moment. Then he nodded and did not ask another question. On the 21st, in the last blue hour before dark, 3 riders came up the wagon track from the south and put their horses in the smokehouse yard. They came into the house one at a time by the kitchen door, and Amelia fed them stew and cornbread and coffee at the table, and Wes Coombs, who had a wife of his own back in town and had heard every rumor Ash Fork Bend had produced in October, tipped his hat to Amelia and said, "Ma'am, I'm obliged to you." Amelia signed something to Ruth. Ruth translated with an important little face. She says you're welcome and there's more coffee. Wes Coombs's mouth twitched under his mustache. I'll take it. The moon set at 11:42 that night. Christopher had checked the almanac twice. By midnight, the yard was black. By 1, the barn was black. By 2, the whole world was black, except for the single low coal Amelia had left banked in the kitchen stove, so that a hand held over it would show the faintest orange line along the fingers, enough to shape a sign by. They came at 2:17. 4 riders. Amelia saw them first, from the small back window she had kept watch at for 6 nights. She did not shout. She did not need to. She crossed the hallway in her stocking feet and touched Christopher's shoulder where he sat waiting in the dark kitchen, and she made 3 quick signs against the faint glow of the stove. 4 men. North fence. Coming, Christopher signed back. Sam? Woodpile? Ready? Ruth? With me. Under the table. Wes? Bunkhouse. Waiting for your signal. Christopher rose. He took his rifle from the corner. He crossed to the front window, cracked the shutter 1 finger's width, and looked out into the yard. They came in exactly the way a man comes who has counted a place twice and thinks he knows it. The 4 riders dismounted at the north fence and led their horses in on foot. Christopher watched 2 of them separate off toward the corral gate. A third moved along the barn wall toward the loading door. The fourth stayed back near the horses, holding the reins. Christopher signed, low and small against the stove's coal. 2 barn, 1 gate, 1 with horses. From the far corner of the kitchen, where Samuel had crawled to the window over the woodbox, a small pale hand rose against the dark and signed back. I see the 1 with horses. From the woodpile, I can see him. Amelia's hand moved from beneath the kitchen table. Ruth's safe. Ready? Christopher waited. He waited until the man at the loading door had his hand on the latch. Because a rustler with his hand on a latch is a rustler a court will convict. Then he opened the front shutter another 2 inches and held his lamp up in the window, and he uncovered the flame twice. 2 long flashes. From the bunkhouse across the yard, an answering flash. Then the bunkhouse door came open, and 3 men came out of it at a low run. And Wes Coombs's voice cut across the yard like a whip. Sheriff, hands up, you are surrounded. The rustler at the loading door spun and ran. The 2 at the corral gate broke in opposite directions. The 1 with the horses tried to mount. Samuel, 10 years old, in his stocking feet behind the woodpile, did exactly what his father had told him to do and no more. He did not fire the small rifle in his hands. He simply banged the flat of an axe head against the iron rim of the wagon wheel 3 times. Hard, and the tethered horses reared and jerked their reins loose from the man's hand, and the man was left standing in the open yard with no cover and no mount when Wes Coombs's deputy reached him. It was over in 90 seconds. 3 of the 4 went down without a shot fired. The 4th, the one who had run for the loading door, took a bullet in the leg from Wes Coombs himself as he tried to cut across the pasture. He lived. He talked later in a great deal of detail about a man in Ash Fork Bend who ran a marriage bureau and also, as it turned out, a small side business in the disposal of stolen cattle to buyers who did not ask where the brand had come from. Elias Dyer was arrested on the 23rd of December. He was tried in April. He served 11 years. The Spring Church Social at Ash Fork Bend that year was held the 2nd Sunday of May in the yard behind the Methodist Church under a canvas awning strung between 4 cottonwoods. Half the county came. Christopher came with his family. Amelia wore a pale green dress she had sewn herself over the winter. Ruth wore a matching ribbon. Samuel wore his first proper collar and pretended it did not bother him. Elias Dyer was not there, of course. But a man had come out from the Bureau's home office in Cheyenne to see about the ruined business, and he was there in a black coat, standing near the coffee urn, and when he saw Christopher, he came over with the careful smile of a man who has been sent to smooth something. "Mr. Redding," he said, "on behalf of the Bureau, I want to convey our deepest regret. Had we known the girl's condition, Ruth signed something to Amelia. Amelia signed back. Samuel, standing beside his father, signed something to both of them, and Ruth laughed out loud, a bright, clear child's laugh that turned 3 heads at the coffee urn." The man from Cheyenne stopped talking. He looked from face to face. "I don't," he said. "I'm sorry, I don't understand what—" Christopher watched his family finish their conversation. Then he looked back at the man from Cheyenne. His face was perfectly calm. "My wife just said something to my daughter," Christopher said. "My daughter answered her. My son corrected my daughter's grammar. Then my wife told my son not to be a smart aleck." The man from Cheyenne stared. "You asked about her condition," Christopher said. "I'll translate 4 words for you. The rest my family will keep." He turned to Amelia. She was watching his mouth, the way she had watched it on the platform in October, steady and gray-eyed and entirely unafraid. Christopher spoke the 4 words slowly so the whole yard could hear him, and so his wife could read them from his lips. "Useless. Look at her." Amelia smiled. It was the full smile, the one that changed her whole face. Ruth reached up and took her hand. Samuel, without being asked, stepped a half-pace closer to her other side. The man from Cheyenne set his coffee down and walked away. Out on the frontier, in a country where a man could lose a wife to a fever with no name, and a woman could be handed a single choice between a Wyoming stage and a Boston laundry, a family had learned to speak in the dark. They had learned because one of them had always had to. And the house at Silverlark Draw, which had been silent in the worst way for 2 long years, was never silent in that way again.